Welcome to Woo English, where you can learn English through stories that captivate, inspire, and transport you to worlds both real and imagined. Today, we begin the incredible journey of Saladin, one of history's most remarkable figures, a warrior, a leader, and a man whose legacy echoes across time. This story is more than just an adventure. It's an opportunity to practice English, build your vocabulary, and improve your listening skills, all while diving into the fascinating life of Saladin. Each chapter is designed with simple language and dramatic moments to keep you engaged and help you learn as you follow his rise to greatness. So sit back, relax, and let's begin this epic journey together. You'll not only experience history come to life, you'll strengthen your English, one word at a time. Now, let's step into the world of Saladin. Chapter 1. The Boy Who Dreamed of Conquest. The wind howled across the dusty streets of Tikrit, whispering secrets of far-off lands, battles yet to be fought, and a future unknown. There, in the heart of the bustling town, a young boy darted through the narrow alleys, his feet kicking up clouds of dirt as he ran. His name? Yusuf ibn Ayyub. But one day, the world would know him as Saladin. "Faster, Yusuf!" came the shout of his cousin, Imad, barely visible ahead in the haze of afternoon heat. But Yusuf wasn't thinking of their race. His mind was far away, caught up in a dream, a vision of something greater. His heart pounded, not just from running, but from the spark of ambition that had lived inside him for as long as he could remember. He reached the end of the alley, panting, the sound of his cousin's laughter echoing in the distance. Yusuf didn't care about winning. No, what mattered more was what he saw, what he imagined when he stopped to catch his breath. There, at the edge of town, stood the castle of Tikrit, its tall stone walls like silent sentinels guarding the past, and perhaps his future. He had heard the stories, his father's voice echoing in his ears even now. "Our family. We come from warriors, Yusuf, men who faced enemies in battle, men who built empires." His father's eyes had always blazed with pride as he spoke, as though he himself were reliving those great moments. "Your uncle Shirkuh. He's a commander, a leader, and one day, you will be too." Yusuf had smiled, but inside he wondered, what if I could be more? What if he could unite lands, reclaim holy places, achieve victories that would echo through the centuries? Yet, in moments like this, standing at the edge of his small world, he felt the weight of his own youth. He was just a boy with dreams bigger than this dusty town. He longed for more than the stories, more than the everyday routine. He wanted the truth. He wanted to live it. He squinted up at the castle again, the harsh sunlight glaring in his eyes. What was beyond those walls? Beyond Tikrit? His father had often spoken of the Crusaders, invaders from distant lands who had taken Jerusalem, the holy city. And in those moments, Yusuf felt something stir deep inside, something hot and unrelenting, a fierce desire to see that city himself, to reclaim it, to defend his people. But for now, all he could do was wait and learn. The evenings in Tikrit were quieter, but not silent. The marketplace still bustled as traders packed up their goods, donkeys brayed in the distance, and the faint hum of voices carried on the wind. Inside Yusuf's home, the smell of roasted lamb filled the air, rich and comforting. He sat close to his father, his small hands resting on his knees, his eyes wide with attention. Tonight was different. His uncle, Shirkuh, was there, seated across the fire, his face shadowed but unmistakably fierce. A battle-hardened man with stories etched into his skin like scars, Shirkuh commanded respect wherever he went. And Yusuf? He could feel the weight of his uncle's presence, the sheer strength of the man who had seen war firsthand. Yusuf! Shirkuh's voice was rough, like the desert wind. He leaned forward, fixing his nephew with a sharp gaze. Do you know what it means to be a leader? Yusuf swallowed hard. He knew what was expected of him, to listen, to learn. It means to be strong, he said slowly, to guide others, to protect them. Shirkuh nodded, but there was a glint in his eye, a challenge. Yes, but it also means sacrifice. It means to carry the burden of others' lives and to make choices no one else can. Are you ready for that? Yusuf hesitated. Was he ready? Could he, a boy from a small town, truly bear such weight? His heart raced again, not from fear, but from excitement. He didn't know if he was ready, but he wanted to be. He needed to be. I will be, he said, his voice firmer this time. Shirkuh studied him for a moment longer before a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Good, he said, because the time will come, Yusuf, sooner than you think. Yusuf's mind swirled with possibilities as his uncle and father continued to talk deep into the night. He listened, his heart swelling with pride and anticipation. This was the world he was born into, a world of warriors, of strategy, of destiny. And soon, it would be his world too. Days passed, then weeks, then months. Yusuf trained every day, learning the art of the sword, the bow, the spear. His muscles ached, his hands blistered, but he pushed through the pain. There was something driving him, something far more powerful than the commands of his teachers. Ambition. It was in his every move, every strike. He wasn't just practicing for battle, he was preparing for his future. Each time his sword clanged against his opponents, each time he parried and struck, he imagined himself on the battlefield, leading armies, facing enemies not just with strength, but with cunning, with wisdom. And as he grew older, the whispers around him began to change. No longer was he just Yusuf, no longer just the boy. His teachers saw it, his father saw it, even Shirkuh, the hardened commander, saw it. This boy, they would murmur, he's not like the others. Yusuf felt it too, the shift, the change in the air around him. He wasn't a child anymore. He was becoming something else, something stronger, something destined for greatness. But with that came pressure, expectation, the heavy burden of leadership. Would he rise to the challenge? One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in hues of red and gold, Yusuf stood alone on a hill outside Tikrit. The wind brushed through his hair, cooling the sweat from his day of training. He looked out over the land, this land that had raised him, shaped him. But soon, it would no longer be enough. His gaze drifted eastward toward the distant horizon where his dreams lay, the Holy Land, Jerusalem, the place he had heard about in countless stories, the city that had been lost. His heart thudded in his chest, his breath quickened. The dream was no longer just a whisper in the back of his mind. It was alive, burning within him, driving him forward. He knew now with absolute certainty what his future would hold. Someday, he whispered to the wind, I will reclaim it. And with that, young Yusuf ibn Ayyub, The boy who had once run through the dusty streets of Tikrit turned his back on the past and set his sights on the future. Chapter 2. Whispers of War. Shadows of the Future. The night was still, yet filled with an air of unease, the kind of unease that slithers into a young man's heart, wrapping itself tight, never letting go. Above, the stars blinked down, indifferent to the storm brewing in the world below. For Yusuf, now older, no longer the wide-eyed boy from Tikrit, the whispers of war had grown louder, louder than ever before. Inside his family's tent, the fire crackled and popped, casting flickering shadows on the faces around him. His uncle, Shirkuh, sat across the flames, his voice a low growl as he spoke of the latest battles, the latest losses. The Crusaders. They had taken Jerusalem. Jerusalem! The holy city, a jewel lost to the invaders from the west. Yusuf leaned in closer, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear it, the thundering of horses, the clashing of swords, the cries of men. But it wasn't just the sounds of battle that gripped him, it was the call of destiny. Jerusalem, Shirkuh said, his voice trailing off like a distant wind. His weathered face was tense, his fists clenched at his sides. A city that belongs to us, a city that must be taken back. The words hung in the air like a challenge, a spark that ignited something deep within Yusuf. His hands trembled, not with fear, but with something else. Excitement? Anticipation? Or was it the realization that everything he had dreamed of was now within reach? Shirkuh's eyes flicked to Yusuf. "You listen well, boy," he said, his voice gruff. "But do you understand? War is not just about winning or losing. It is about sacrifice. It is about blood." Yusuf's throat tightened, but he did not look away. "I understand, Uncle," he said, his voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside him. But did he truly understand? Could anyone really understand the horrors of war without experiencing them? Yusuf wasn't sure, but he wanted to understand. He wanted to feel it, live it, conquer it. The next morning, the camp was alive with movement. Soldiers sharpening their blades, men speaking in low, urgent tones. The tension in the air was thick enough to taste. Yusuf watched them, his heart racing. He had trained for this, long hours spent mastering the sword, the spear, the bow. But training was one thing, war was another. Shirkuh stood beside him, his hand resting on Yusuf's shoulder. "This will be your first campaign," he said, his voice softer now, almost tender. "Are you ready?" Yusuf looked up at his uncle, the man who had taught him so much, who had shown him the ways of war. He nodded, though the tightness in his chest did not ease. "I am ready," he said, though his mind echoed with 1,000 thoughts. Could he really be ready? Was anyone ever truly ready for war? But there was no turning back. The call had come. The time was now. As they marched across the desert, the heat was relentless. The sun beat down on them without mercy. And yet, Yusuf's mind was far from the discomfort. His thoughts were consumed by the stories he had heard growing up, the tales of conquest, of battles won and lost, of the great city of Jerusalem. Jerusalem. The very word seemed to pulse with life, with importance. He could almost see it in the distance, the city of stone and spirit, shining under the same sun that now scorched his skin. "We fight for more than land," Shirkuh's voice broke through Yusuf's thoughts. "We fight for something sacred. You will learn this, Yusuf. The Crusaders have taken what is not theirs, and we will take it back. Yusuf clenched his fists, the fire in his heart burning brighter. I want to see it, he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. I want to see Jerusalem. Shirkuh glanced at him, a shadow of a smile crossing his face. You will, he said, but first, you must fight. The day of battle came like a storm. The air was thick with dust and tension, and the ground beneath Yusuf's feet trembled with the thunder of hooves. He stood with his sword in hand, his heart hammering in his chest. This was it, his first battle. The moment he had been waiting for. The moment he would prove himself. The Crusader forces were just visible on the horizon, a sea of gleaming armor and banners flapping in the wind. Yusuf swallowed hard. His hands trembled again, but this time it was not excitement. It was something darker, something heavier. Fear? He glanced at Shirkuh, who stood tall and steady, his face as unreadable as ever. His uncle had been in countless battles. He had faced death and conquered it. And now it was Yusuf's turn. The signal was given. With a deafening roar, the Muslim forces surged forward, charging toward the enemy. Yusuf's heart leaped into his throat as he raced alongside them, the sound of battle filling his ears. His sword felt heavy in his hand, but he gripped it tighter, his knuckles white. The first clash came with a crash of metal, a blur of movement and noise. Yusuf swung his sword, his mind reeling with the chaos around him. He parried, he struck, he ducked, and then he saw them, the Crusaders. Their eyes locked, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to slow. Yusuf felt the weight of centuries on his shoulders, the weight of history itself. With a shout, he lunged forward, his sword meeting the Crusader's shield with a resounding clang. Sparks flew, and Yusuf's arms ached with the force of the blow. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. His training took over, his movements becoming instinctual, automatic. Every strike, every block, every breath. It was as if he had been preparing for this moment his entire life. And then, it was over. The Crusader fell, his armor clattering to the ground. Yusuf stood over him, his chest heaving, his sword still clenched in his trembling hand. He had done it. He had fought. He had survived. That night, as the camp settled and the fires burned low, Yusuf sat alone, staring into the flames. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a strange emptiness. He had imagined this moment so many times, but now that it had come, it felt different. The glory of battle, the thrill of victory, it was all there. But so was the blood, the death, the loss. Shirkuh joined him by the fire, his eyes hard, but his voice soft. This is war, Yusuf. It is not always glorious, but it is necessary. Yusuf nodded, though his mind was still racing. He had won his first battle. But at what cost? And yet, deep inside, that fire still burned. The whispers of war had called to him, and he had answered. But now, new whispers filled his mind. Whispers of destiny, of Jerusalem, of something far greater than any single battle. As the night stretched on, Yusuf's hands stopped trembling. He was no longer a boy dreaming of conquest. He was a warrior, and his journey had only just begun. Chapter 3. Into the Fire, the First Battle. The air was thick, heavy with anticipation. Overhead, the sky darkened, the sun slipping behind the horizon as if hiding from the storm of violence that was about to unfold. Saladin stood among the soldiers, his breath quick and shallow. His heart pounded in his chest, faster and faster, louder than the drum beats echoing in the distance. This was it, his first real battle. The moment he had trained for, dreamed of, feared. Around him the men shifted, their eyes fixed ahead, their faces hard, unreadable. Some whispered prayers, others gripped their weapons tighter, knuckles white with tension. But Saladin? He stood still, his sword at his side, his heart racing not just with fear, but something else. Something deep, something primal. Was it excitement? A sudden horn blared, breaking the silence like a crack of thunder. The enemy appeared on the horizon, a swarm of Crusaders, their armor glinting in the fading light. Saladin's breath hitched in his throat. They were so close now. His grip tightened around his sword, his palms slick with sweat. "Steady!" His uncle Shirku's voice boomed over the chaos, steady and strong. "Steady!" The line of soldiers surged forward, the ground trembling beneath their feet. Saladin moved with them, but his mind was a whirlwind, spinning with the noise of clashing metal and war cries. His heartbeat quickened. His steps felt heavier with each second, as if the weight of his sword and shield were pulling him down into the very earth. Suddenly, the front lines collided, metal against metal, shield against shield. The sound of swords clashing rang out, high and sharp, like the cry of a hawk. Men grunted, screamed, fell. Saladin's eyes widened as chaos erupted around him. The world blurred, faces, weapons, the sky overhead. He swung his sword, blocking an enemy's strike, but the force sent a jolt through his arm. He stumbled, his breath knocked from his chest. Was this it? Had he already failed? Another strike came. Saladin barely parried in time. His sword clanged against the enemy's blade, his knees buckling. He stepped back, gasping for breath. His mind screamed at him to fight, to move, to survive. But his body froze. For a moment it all seemed hopeless. The battle swirled around him, a storm of death and destruction, and Saladin, young, untested, felt small, too small. The screams of wounded men, the clang of weapons, the roar of soldiers filled his ears. He blinked, trying to focus, trying to block out the noise, but his legs refused to move. Was this how it ended? Would the battlefield claim him before his journey had truly begun? Then, something shifted. A Crusader charged toward him, his sword raised high. Time seemed to slow as the figure loomed closer, closer, the blade glinting in the dying light. Saladin's heart thundered in his chest. This was it. He had to act, or fall. And in that moment, something inside him snapped. With a roar, Saladin raised his sword, meeting the Crusader's strike with all his strength. Metal clashed with a deafening ring. His arm ached with the force of it, but he didn't falter this time. He gritted his teeth, his muscles burning with the effort as he pushed the Crusader back. And for the first time, he felt it, that spark, that fire. It roared to life inside him, fueling his every move, sharpening his focus. He wanted to win. He needed to win. Saladin struck again, his sword slashing through the air. His movements were no longer clumsy, no longer uncertain. He fought with precision, with purpose. The Crusader staggered back, eyes wide with surprise. Saladin's heart raced, not with fear, but with power. This was what he had trained for. This was what he was born to do. With a final strike, the Crusader fell, his sword slipping from his grasp, his body crumpling to the ground. Saladin stood over him, breathless, his chest heaving. Blood stained his blade. His hands trembled, but this time, it wasn't from fear. He had done it. He had survived. but there was no time to rest. The battle raged on around him, and Saladin was far from finished. He pushed forward, his sword cutting through the chaos, his mind sharp and clear. The enemy came at him from all sides, shouts, strikes, steel flashing in the dim light. But Saladin met each one with a fierce determination, his movements fluid and fierce. With each swing of his sword, he felt that hunger growing, that need for victory. The fear that had once gripped him was gone, replaced by something far more powerful. Resolve. He would not fall today. He could not fall today. The sounds of battle became a rhythm, a drum beat that matched the pounding of his heart. Strike, block, parry, move. His body moved instinctively now, every action precise, controlled. He fought not just for himself, but for something greater. The dream of Jerusalem, the weight of his family's legacy, it all pressed on him, but instead of crushing him, it lifted him. And then he saw him, a Crusader captain, standing tall in the midst of the battlefield, his armor gleaming, his sword dripping with the blood of Saladin's comrades. The man's eyes met Saladin's, and for a brief moment, everything else faded away. The noise, the chaos, the pain, it was all gone. There was only this moment, this enemy. Without thinking, Saladin charged. His feet pounded the earth, his sword raised high. The captain turned, raising his shield just in time to block Saladin's strike. Metal clanged against metal, the force of the blow sending shockwaves through Saladin's arms. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. They clashed again, their swords meeting with a sharp ring. The captain was strong, stronger than anyone Saladin had faced so far. But Saladin, he fought with fire, with purpose, with destiny. Their swords locked, their faces inches apart. The captain sneered, pushing against Saladin's blade with all his might. "You're just a boy," he growled, his voice thick with disdain. "You think you can defeat me?" Saladin's eyes blazed, his muscles burned with the effort, but he refused to back down. "I don't think," he hissed through gritted teeth. "I know." With a surge of strength, Saladin twisted his sword, breaking free from the captain's hold. He spun, his blade flashing through the air, and struck. The captain staggered, a gasp escaping his lips as the sword found its mark. He fell to his knees, his eyes wide with shock. Saladin stood over him, his chest heaving, his sword dripping with blood. He had done it. He had won. But as he looked down at the fallen enemy, a strange feeling washed over him. Victory, yes, but also something else, something heavier. As the battle began to quiet, the sound of retreating Crusaders fading into the distance, Saladin stood in the middle of the battlefield, his sword still in hand, his body trembling with exhaustion. The sky had darkened completely now, the stars appearing one by one, watching silently from above. Saladin looked around at the fallen men, friend and foe alike, the weight of what had happened settling on his shoulders. He had survived. But war was not just about surviving, it was about sacrifice, about loss. And as Saladin stood there, his chest heaving, his hands still trembling, he realized that this was only the beginning. The fire inside him still burned, hotter than ever. He had tasted victory, but he craved more. The road ahead would be long, difficult, but he would walk it. He would fight it. Because now Saladin knew. His destiny was far greater than any one battle. Chapter 4. Rise of the Lion, the Making of a Leader. The air still buzzed with the energy of battle. Victory. It clung to the men like the scent of sweat and blood, an intoxicating mixture that left them dizzy with pride. But for Saladin, it was different. The thrill of the fight still pulsed in his veins, but it wasn't just about triumph anymore. It was about something more, something deeper. As he stood on the battlefield, surrounded by fallen enemies and the quiet murmurs of his own soldiers, Saladin felt it. That pull, that shift. The world was changing, and so was he. The whispers began immediately after the battle. "Did you see him?" they said. "The young lion. He fights like he's been in 100 wars." Word spread quickly through the ranks of Saladin's courage, his strength, his sharp mind in the heat of chaos. His name traveled faster than the wind, carried from tent to tent, soldier to soldier, until even the highest commanders knew who he was. And that's when they came for him. It was late in the evening when Saladin was summoned to the commander's tent. The camp was quiet, the fires burning low, casting flickering shadows on the ground. Saladin's heart raced as he approached the tent. This was it. The moment he had waited for. The moment he would prove himself not just as a soldier, but as a leader. Inside the tent, the air was thick with the smell of incense and the soft murmurs of powerful men. His uncle Shirkuh was there, seated at the head of the group, his eyes sharp as always, watching, judging. But there were others, men Saladin had only heard about in whispers, generals, advisors, leaders who could change the course of a war with a single word. Saladin entered, his chest tight with anticipation. He felt their eyes on him, weighing him, testing him. His heart pounded in his chest, but he stood tall, his face calm, his mind clear. This was no longer the boy who trembled at the sight of his first enemy. This was a man who had tasted victory and craved more. Shirkuh spoke first, his voice rough but filled with pride. "This is the young lion I spoke of, the one who fights not with fear, but with fire." His gaze met Saladin's, and for the first time, his uncle's eyes softened, just a little. "He is ready." The men exchanged glances, nodding slowly, murmuring their approval. But one of them, a tall man with a scar across his cheek, leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Ready for what, exactly?" he asked, his voice low and skeptical. "To lead men? To make decisions that could cost lives? War is more than just swinging a sword, boy. Can you handle the weight of leadership?" Saladin's breath caught in his throat. This was it. His moment to prove himself. He could feel the tension in the air, thick like the desert heat, pressing down on him. But he did not falter. He met the man's gaze, his voice steady. "I understand the weight of leadership," he said. "It's not just about winning battles. It's about protecting those who fight with you, guiding them, even when the path is unclear. I've seen what war does to men, and I know what it means to lead." The tent fell silent, the words hanging in the air. Saladin's heart pounded, but he held his ground, refusing to show any sign of doubt. Inside, his mind raced. Was that enough? Had he convinced them? Then the man with the scar leaned back, a slow smile creeping across his face. "He's got fire," he said, his voice softer now. "And maybe that's what we need." Shirkuh nodded, his eyes gleaming with pride. "He's more than ready." The days that followed were a whirlwind. Saladin was given more responsibility, more men to command, more decisions to make. At first, the weight of it all was overwhelming. Every choice felt like it carried the weight of 1,000 lives. One wrong move, and everything could fall apart. But Saladin thrived under the pressure. His mind, sharp as a blade, seemed to cut through the chaos of war like nothing else. He saw the battlefield differently than the others. He saw not just the soldiers and the weapons, but the strategy, the patterns, the ways in which small movements could shift the entire course of a fight. And soon, others began to see it too. His men, once unsure of their young leader, began to trust him. They followed him not just out of duty, but out of belief. They saw the calm in his eyes, the confidence in his voice, and they knew they were in the hands of someone who would not lead them astray. But with power came danger. Not everyone was pleased with Saladin's rise. Whispers of envy, of jealousy, began to creep through the camp. Old commanders, men who had fought for years, watched with narrowed eyes as this young upstart took the spotlight. They questioned his loyalty, his motives. Was he truly fighting for the cause or for his own glory? Saladin felt the tension growing, a storm brewing just beneath the surface. He knew that one wrong move could bring everything crashing down. But he also knew that he could not back down. Not now. Not when the path to greatness was finally within his reach. One night, as the camp slept, Saladin stood alone on a hill overlooking the tents. The stars glittered overhead, cold and distant. His heart was heavy, his mind filled with the weight of responsibility. The battles ahead would be fierce, the enemies even fiercer. And within his own ranks, he knew that not everyone stood with him. But then he remembered the taste of victory, the roar of the battlefield, the feeling of triumph surging through his veins. He remembered the men who had followed him, trusted him, and most of all, he remembered why he fought. For his people, for his family, for something far greater than himself. The fire inside him, that had sparked in his first battle, burned brighter than ever. He was no longer just a soldier, no longer just a man chasing after glory. He was something more. He was a leader, a lion, rising from the shadows to claim his place in history. But the question still lingered in the air. Could he truly rise to become a legend? Saladin stood tall, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He knew the road ahead would be long, dangerous, but he also knew one thing for certain. He was ready for whatever came next. Chapter 5. Ambition's Price. Betrayal in the Desert. The desert stretched endlessly before him, a sea of golden sand under the harsh sun. It was quiet, too quiet. The wind carried only the faintest whispers, but Saladin could feel it. Something was wrong. He could sense the weight of treachery in the air, pressing down like the burning heat. Not all battles are fought with swords. Some, Saladin knew now, were fought with whispers, with shadows that crept up behind you when you weren't looking. He stood at the edge of the camp, his eyes scanning the horizon. The men around him busied themselves with their duties, sharpening blades, tending to horses. They trusted him. He could see it in their faces. But trust was a fragile thing, easily broken. Saladin's ambitions had grown. He had risen quickly, too quickly for some. The victories, the praise, the power, it was intoxicating. But with power came danger. With every step he climbed, new enemies seemed to appear. And sometimes they wore the faces of friends. That evening, as the sun dipped below the dunes, casting long shadows across the camp, Saladin sat with his most trusted advisors. They spoke in low voices, the flickering firelight casting their faces in an eerie glow. "Word is spreading," one of them said, his voice barely above a whisper. "There are those who think You're growing too strong. Saladin's eyes narrowed. He had expected this, of course. Power always attracted envy. But now it seemed the whispers were becoming more than just idle talk. They were turning into something darker, something dangerous. Who? Saladin asked, his voice calm but edged with steel. Who speaks against me? The advisor hesitated, glancing around as if the shadows themselves were listening. It's not just one, my lord. It's several. There are rumors that some within our ranks, those you once called allies, are plotting against you. Saladin's chest tightened. Betrayal. The word hung heavy in the air, sharp as a blade. He had fought on the battlefield, faced enemies who came at him with swords drawn. But this was different. This was a war fought in secret, with lies and deceit as weapons. Who could he trust? The next morning, Saladin rode out into the desert. The air was dry, the sun unrelenting. He needed to clear his mind, to think. His horse's hooves kicked up sand with each step, the rhythmic sound calming the storm that raged within him. As he rode, his thoughts turned to the men who had stood beside him in battle, who had fought for him, followed him without question. Were they still loyal? Or had some of them already turned, whispering his name in the darkness, plotting his downfall? Saladin gritted his teeth, his hands tightening on the reins. He had come too far, fought too hard, to be undone by betrayal now. He would root out the traitors, one by one, if he had to. But the thought weighed heavy on him. How could he fight an enemy he couldn't see? The desert wind picked up, blowing sand in swirling patterns around him. It seemed to echo his thoughts, carrying with it the secrets of those who plotted in silence. Saladin knew he couldn't afford to trust blindly anymore. But doubt could be a poison, just as deadly as betrayal. That night, the winds howled through the camp, carrying with them the uneasy tension that had settled like a shroud over the men. Saladin lay awake in his tent, his mind racing. Every sound seemed louder in the stillness, the rustle of fabric, the distant murmur of voices, the faint clinking of armor. Who could it be? He wondered, his eyes staring up at the dark canvas above him. He thought of the men he had fought beside, the ones who had bled for him, who had stood with him in the heat of battle. Had ambition poisoned their hearts too? Could they really be plotting against him now? Suddenly, a noise outside his tent snapped him from his thoughts. Footsteps, quiet, cautious. His hand instinctively moved to the hilt of his sword, his muscles tense. He listened, every fiber of his being alert. The footsteps stopped just outside the tent flap. There was a pause, and then the soft rustle of someone entering. Saladin's heart raced, but he remained still, waiting. "Saladin," a voice whispered in the darkness. Saladin sat up, his sword drawn in an instant. "Who's there?" A figure stepped into the faint light, hands raised in surrender. It was one of his most trusted captains, a man who had fought beside him for years. Saladin's grip on his sword loosened slightly, but he did not lower it. "What are you doing here?" Saladin asked, his voice cold. The captain looked around nervously before speaking. "I came to warn you. There are men close to you, who are planning to betray you. Tonight." Saladin's eyes narrowed. His heart pounded in his chest, a mixture of anger and fear coursing through him. Tonight. "Who?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. "Tell me who they are." The captain hesitated, his eyes flickering with uncertainty. I don't know all of them," he admitted, But I heard talk. They plan to strike when you're vulnerable, to take control while you sleep. Saladin's mind raced. This was it. The betrayal he had feared was no longer just whispers in the wind. It was real, and it was happening now. Saladin acted swiftly. Within moments, his closest loyal soldiers were at his side, ready for whatever was to come. They moved through the camp like shadows, eyes scanning every face, every corner. Saladin's heart raced as they searched, but there was no sign of an attack. Not yet. The night stretched on, tense and quiet, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. Saladin could feel the danger lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to strike. He didn't know who he could trust anymore, but he knew one thing for certain. He would not go down without a fight. As dawn approached, the camp remained eerily silent. Saladin stood at the edge, his sword in hand, his eyes scanning the horizon. Had the traitors abandoned their plan? Or were they still out there, waiting for the perfect moment to strike? The uncertainty gnawed at him, but he couldn't let it show. He was a leader now, and leaders did not falter, even when the ground beneath them threatened to give way. As the first light of day crept over the dunes, Saladin's heart began to calm. The immediate threat had passed. For now. But he knew this was only the beginning. The price of ambition was high, and betrayal was its cruelest cost. Saladin turned toward the camp, his eyes hard with resolve. The traitors had not yet shown themselves, but he would be ready when they did. And when that time came, he would face them not as the boy who once trembled on the battlefield, but as a leader, a lion, one who had learned the hardest lesson of all. Not all enemies wear the face of strangers. Chapter 6. The Siege of Cairo, Will of a Warrior. Cairo, the jewel of Egypt. Its ancient walls stood tall, majestic, almost defiant under the blazing sun. The city's minarets reached toward the heavens, as if whispering secrets to the desert winds. Saladin gazed upon it, his heart pounding with both anticipation and unease. This city, this fortress, was the key to power in Egypt, a prize that could not be ignored. But claiming it, that would be a different story. Saladin stood at the head of his army, the air thick with heat and tension. Sweat dripped down his brow, stinging his eyes, but he did not flinch. His men looked to him, trusting, waiting, ready. They had fought many battles beside him, but Cairo was different. It was a challenge unlike any other, and Saladin knew that if he were to seize it, he would need more than just strength. He would need cunning, he would need patience, he would need the will of a warrior. The siege began as the sun rose high, casting the desert in a blinding light. The walls of Cairo loomed ahead, strong and impenetrable, but Saladin's determination was stronger. The city had stood for centuries, and today it would face a force unlike any it had ever known. Saladin gave the signal. The horns blared, their deep tones echoing across the sands. His army surged forward, a wave of steel and fury. Battering rams thundered against the city gates, while arrows darkened the sky, raining down upon the defenders. The walls of Cairo trembled beneath the assault, but they held firm. From the safety of the battlements, the defenders hurled down rocks, boiling oil, anything they could find to push back the attackers. The clash of steel, the cries of men, the constant thud of the battering rams, it was a symphony of chaos. Yet amidst the noise, Saladin stood calm. His mind raced with strategy, each movement of his troops carefully calculated. But Cairo did not yield easily. The scorching heat pressed down on Saladin and his men like a cruel hand, draining their energy with every passing hour. The sand beneath their feet seemed to shift, dragging them down, making each step feel heavier than the last. Days passed, then weeks. The siege dragged on, and whispers of doubt began to creep through the ranks. "Can we take it?" they murmured when they thought Saladin could not hear. "The walls, they're too strong." Saladin heard the whispers. He felt the weight of his men's doubts pressing down on him, but he could not afford to falter now. His gaze remained fixed on Cairo's towering walls, his jaw clenched with determination. This city would fall. It had to. One evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, casting a red glow over the desert, Saladin stood alone on a dune, staring out at Cairo. The city glimmered in the fading light, almost mocking him. It had withstood everything he had thrown at it. And yet, despite the overwhelming odds, Saladin's heart still beat with hope. He could feel it. The city's defenses were weakening. The long siege was taking its toll, not just on his army, but on the people of Cairo. Supplies were running low. Morale was faltering. The once mighty walls seemed less imposing now. But could he outlast them? Could he keep pushing, keep fighting, when his own men were growing weary? Saladin closed his eyes, letting the cool desert wind wash over him. He thought of the battles he had fought, the betrayals he had faced, the sacrifices he had made. Everything had led him to this moment. He could not fail. He would not fail. Suddenly a voice broke through his thoughts. "My lord," it was one of his commanders, breathless and urgent. "There's news from inside the city." Saladin turned sharply, his eyes narrowing. "What news?" The commander hesitated, his face grim. "There are rumors, factions within the city. The people are divided. Some want to surrender, others refuse to yield." Saladin's heart leaped, divided. This was his chance. If the people of Cairo were already turning against one another, then perhaps, just perhaps, he could win this siege without breaking down the walls. Perhaps he could conquer the city with strategy rather than sheer force. The next day, Saladin sent emissaries to the city gates. Their message was simple: surrender, and you will be spared. Refuse, and you will face annihilation. The hours stretched on in agonizing silence. His men watched the city with bated breath, their hearts pounding with hope and fear. Would Cairo yield, or would the battle drag on with more bloodshed, more death? Finally, as the sun hung low in the sky, the city gates creaked open. A small group of leaders emerged, their faces weary and drawn. They approached Saladin's camp slowly, the weight of their decision heavy on their shoulders. Saladin stood tall as they neared, his eyes locked on theirs. He could see the fear in their eyes, the uncertainty. Cairo was on the brink of collapse, and they knew it. The siege had broken them, not just their walls, but their will. One of the leaders stepped forward, his voice low and strained. We are prepared to discuss terms of surrender." A murmur rippled through Saladin's men, a wave of relief and excitement, but Saladin remained calm. He could not show weakness now, not when victory was so close. "You have chosen wisely," he said, his voice firm but not without compassion. "Your people will be spared. Your city will be taken with honor." The leaders bowed their heads, the weight of defeat hanging heavy on them. But for Saladin, this was more than just a victory. It was a moment of triumph, not just for his army, but for his own willpower. He had conquered not only Cairo, but his own doubts, his own fears. As night fell and the fires of celebration lit up the camp, Saladin stood once more on the dune, looking out over the city. Cairo, the jewel of Egypt, was his. But as the cheers of his men echoed behind him, Saladin's thoughts were not on the victory itself, but on the battles still to come. This was just the beginning. The road ahead would be long, fraught with danger and betrayal. But Saladin's heart was steady, his resolve stronger than ever. He had proven, not just to his men, but to himself, that he could lead, that he could conquer. The will of a warrior burned in his chest, brighter and fiercer than ever. He turned back to his men, his face set with determination. Egypt was his now, but his gaze, his ambitions, were set on a far greater prize. Jerusalem awaits. Chapter 7. Crowned by victory, haunted by sacrifice. Victory, at last. The air was thick with the scent of triumph, but also something heavier. The sound of celebration echoed through the streets of Cairo. The city that had once stood as an impenetrable fortress was now Saladin's. The jewel of Egypt had fallen into his hands, and with it, a crown, a symbol of power, authority, and destiny. Saladin stood at the highest tower, looking out over the Nile. The river stretched endlessly, its waters reflecting the soft glow of the moon. It was a moment of triumph, of pride. Egypt was his. But as the cool night air brushed his skin, the weight of the crown on his head pressed down like a burden he had not fully anticipated. Was this what I wanted? The question lingered gnawing at him, even as cheers and shouts of victory echoed from below. His people rejoiced, his men sang of his greatness. And yet, Saladin's heart was heavy. The taste of victory was bittersweet. For every city conquered there was a cost. For every victory, a sacrifice. Saladin's mind drifted back to the battles that had brought him here. The siege of Cairo had been grueling, the constant tension, the long days under the scorching sun, the endless nights wondering if they would break through, and then the final moments when the gates had opened, when Cairo had finally yielded. He should have felt nothing but pride, but all he could think about were the lives that had been lost along the way. His soldiers, his brothers in arms. So many had fallen in the heat of battle, their blood soaking into the sand. Faces flashed through his mind, friends, comrades, men who had trusted him to lead them to glory. And now, they were gone. The city was his, but what price had been paid? Saladin clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white. He had always known that leadership would come with sacrifice, but he had never imagined how deep that sacrifice would cut. The weight of those lives pressed down on him, mingling with the weight of the crown. Was this the cost of ambition? The Nile flowed quietly beneath him, a peaceful contrast to the turmoil inside his heart. As a young boy, Saladin had dreamed of conquest. He had imagined himself a great leader, a warrior who would unite the lands, reclaim Jerusalem, and bring honor to his people. And now, standing as the ruler of Egypt, those dreams were becoming reality. But the dreams had never shown him the pain that came with them. For every step he took toward his destiny, something was lost. His innocence, his peace of mind, the belief that victory was pure. Saladin's eyes closed, the sounds of the river lulling him into a momentary calm. But the calm did not last. His mind was haunted by the sacrifices he had made, the lives he had led into battle. The weight of responsibility hung heavy on his shoulders. As a leader, He had to carry it all. The victories, yes, but also the losses. Was this the burden of all great men? To achieve greatness, but always at a cost? Suddenly a voice broke through the stillness. "My lord," it was one of his closest advisers, his voice low, almost hesitant. "The people await you. They wish to see their ruler." Saladin opened his eyes, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. The people, they had cheered him as their savior, as the man who had brought Egypt under Muslim control. They saw him as a hero. But would they still see him that way if they knew the doubts that plagued his heart? The sacrifices that haunted his every step? "I will go," Saladin said, his voice steady, though his heart trembled beneath the calm. "In a moment." The advisor bowed and left him alone once more, alone with his thoughts, with his crown, with the silence of the Nile. Saladin took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He had to be strong. For them, for his people, for the men who had died believing in him. But how could he balance the weight of his own soul with the needs of an entire nation? As the night wore on, Saladin finally descended from the tower. The streets of Cairo were alive with celebration. Banners fluttered in the warm breeze, and the people sang songs of victory. Children ran through the streets, their laughter filling the air. For them, the war was over. For them, Saladin had brought peace. But even in the midst of this joy, Saladin could not escape the shadows that clung to him. He passed by a group of soldiers, their faces filled with pride and exhaustion. They had fought valiantly for him. Many had lost friends, brothers, fathers, but they stood tall, their loyalty unwavering. One of the men stepped forward, his eyes shining with gratitude. "My lord," he said, his voice choked with emotion, "we owe everything to you." Saladin smiled, but the smile did not reach his eyes. He nodded, placing a hand on the man's shoulder. "We have won," he said softly. "But never forget the price we paid." The soldier's smile faltered for a moment, but he nodded solemnly, understanding the weight of his leader's words. Saladin continued walking, the crown on his head feeling heavier with each step. The cheers of the people followed him, but they felt distant, almost hollow. He had won Egypt. He had secured his place as its ruler. But what had he lost in the process? That night, as the city slept and the fires burned low, Saladin stood once more by the Nile, staring out at the dark water. The quiet hum of the river was the only sound that reached him now. The celebrations had faded, the people had gone to their beds, and for the first time since his victory, Saladin was truly alone. He removed the crown from his head, holding it in his hands. The metal was cool against his skin, but its weight was unbearable. Was this crown worth the lives of the men who had followed him? Was it worth the sacrifices he had made? Saladin's eyes clouded with emotion. The path ahead was clear, more battles, more victories, more sacrifices. But tonight, in this moment of silence, the price of his ambition felt almost too great to bear. He lifted his gaze to the stars, his heart heavy. Egypt was his, the crown was his, but so too were the ghosts of those he had lost along the way. "Is this what I truly wanted?" he whispered to the night, the Nile flowing endlessly before him. And in the quiet, no answer came. Chapter 8. The Call of Jerusalem, a Dream of Unity. The air was heavy with the scent of incense, the quiet murmur of voices drifting through the halls. Saladin stood alone, gazing out from the palace window, his mind far away. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting the land in a golden glow. But his thoughts were elsewhere. Across the sea, to Jerusalem. Jerusalem, the holy city. His heart stirred with the mere thought of it. A city revered by Muslims, Christians, and Jews alike. A city that had been under Crusader control for too long. Saladin had heard the whispers, tales of the Crusaders' iron grip, of the suffering of his people, of the sacred land held captive. And now, those whispers had grown louder, like the beating of war drums in his soul. Could it be? Was this his true calling? Egypt was his, yes, but Jerusalem. Jerusalem was something greater, something sacred. The dream of reclaiming it burned within him, brighter than ever. As the evening deepened, one of Saladin's trusted advisers approached, bowing low before speaking. "My lord, news from the north. The Crusaders are fortifying their positions in Jerusalem. Their power grows." Saladin turned, his eyes sharp, piercing through the dim light. "And the people?" he asked, his voice quiet, but filled with intensity. "How do our people fare under their rule?" The advisor hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "They suffer, my lord. The Crusaders, they show no mercy." Saladin's chest tightened. He had heard enough. His mind raced, images of Jerusalem flashing before him, its golden domes, its ancient streets, the sacred Al-Aqsa Mosque, all under the control of foreign invaders. His heart beat faster. His soul cried out, "This is not how it should be. This is not how it must remain." He clenched his fists, his resolve hardening. The Crusaders may have taken Jerusalem, but they had not broken its spirit. And now, Saladin felt it in his bones, the call to liberate the holy city. But this was not just about conquest. No, this was about unity. A dream of bringing together the fractured Muslim world under one banner, one cause. That night Saladin gathered his most trusted commanders, his voice low but steady as he spoke. "Jerusalem," he said, the word alone sending a wave of energy through the room. "It is time." The men exchanged glances, their faces filled with both excitement and apprehension. They had known this moment would come. The holy city had always been on Saladin's mind, but now it was clear. The time had come to act. One of the commanders, an older man with a scarred face, spoke first. "To take Jerusalem, we would need to unite the Muslim world. The Crusaders are strong, my lord. They will not fall easily." Saladin nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I know, but strength is not just in numbers. It is in purpose. It is in unity. And the people, they will rally behind us. This is not just a battle for land. This is a battle for our faith, for our people. Jerusalem must be free." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The men around him nodded slowly, the gravity of the situation sinking in. But Saladin could see it, the spark in their eyes, the same fire that burned in his own heart. They understood. They felt it too. Another voice spoke up, hesitant but hopeful. "Can we unite the Muslim leaders, my lord? The factions, the rivalries? They run deep." Saladin's gaze sharpened. This was the real challenge. The Muslim world was fractured, divided by internal strife, by old grudges and power struggles. To take Jerusalem, Saladin would need more than just his army. He would need to unite the entire Muslim world, to bring together the emirs and sultans who had been at odds for generations. It was a daunting task, but Saladin knew it was the only way. His heart raced, but he pushed aside the fear. "We must," he said firmly. We will not take Jerusalem alone. We will take it together. We will unite the Muslim world under one banner. And when we march to the holy city, we will march as one." His voice grew stronger with each word, his conviction spreading like wildfire through the room. The commanders nodded, their doubts beginning to fade. They could see it now, the vision, the dream. It wasn't just Saladin's dream. It was a dream for all of them, for their people, for their future. Days turned into weeks as Saladin sent emissaries across the Muslim world, reaching out to leaders, to warriors, to scholars. His message was clear: unity. Together they could reclaim Jerusalem. Together they could stand against the Crusaders and take back what was rightfully theirs. But it wasn't easy. The rivalries were deep, the mistrust between factions long-standing. Some leaders balked at the idea of joining forces, unwilling to put aside their own ambitions for the greater good. Others doubted Saladin's ability to lead such a vast coalition. And yet, Saladin persisted. He spoke with passion, with clarity, with a vision that stirred the hearts of those who listened. He traveled from city to city, meeting with rulers, persuading them, convincing them that this was not just about power. It was about faith, about honor, about destiny. Slowly but surely, the tide began to turn. One by one, leaders pledged their allegiance to Saladin's cause. Armies were assembled. Warriors sharpened their swords, prepared to march under Saladin's banner. The dream of unity was becoming a reality. As the sun set on another day of preparation, Saladin stood once more by the river, gazing out at the horizon. His heart was full, but his mind still raced. The path ahead was clear, but it was not without danger. The Crusaders would not yield easily. Blood would be spilled. Lives would be lost. But Saladin knew this was his calling, his destiny. The dream of reclaiming Jerusalem had burned in his heart for as long as he could remember, and now, with the Muslim world rallying behind him, the dream was within reach. He closed his eyes, the sounds of the river and the wind filling his ears. He thought of the boy he had once been, dreaming of conquest, of greatness. And now, here he was, standing on the edge of history. Jerusalem called to him. The holy city waited, and Saladin was ready. With the Muslim world united and the armies prepared, Saladin's heart beat with purpose. The dream burned brighter than ever. He knew his path. But now the question remained: would the world follow? Jerusalem was within his grasp. Chapter 9. Crusaders at the Gates. A battle for the ages. The sun. It burned fiercely overhead, its unforgiving heat scorching the dry plains of Hattin. Dust swirled in the wind, mixing with the smell of sweat, steel, and tension. Across the fields, two mighty armies stood poised, ready, waiting. On one side, the Crusaders, their banners flying high, their armor gleaming in the harsh sunlight. On the other, Saladin's forces, silent but resolute, eyes fixed on the enemy. Saladin sat on his horse at the front of his army, his gaze steady, his heart pounding. This was it, the moment he had waited for, the moment history would remember. The fate of Jerusalem hung in the balance. The Crusaders had come to break him, to crush his dream, to keep the holy city in their iron grip. But Saladin, he was ready. He had united the Muslim world for this very day. He had sharpened his mind and honed his strategies, and now there was no turning back. The Crusaders were close, too close. The ground beneath them shook with the weight of their horses, their war cries rising like a storm. Their king, Guy of Lusignan, rode at their head, determined to smash Saladin's forces and hold on to Jerusalem. But Saladin was no longer the boy who had once dreamt of conquest. He was now a leader, a commander, a lion ready to strike. "Hold the line," Saladin murmured to himself, his voice steady but low, the words meant only for him. His soldiers gripped their weapons tighter, their knuckles white, their eyes filled with resolve. They trusted him. They had to. This was more than just a battle. It was a fight for everything they believed in, for their land, their faith, their future. And then, the Crusaders charged. The ground shook as the Crusader cavalry thundered forward, a wall of steel and horseflesh barreling toward Saladin's ranks. The clattering of hooves, the roar of the Crusaders, it filled the air like the roar of 1,000 storms. Saladin raised his sword high, the sun glinting off its edge, and gave the command, "Now!" With a deafening cry, his army surged forward. Swords clashed, shields splintered, and the battlefield erupted into chaos. The Crusaders crashed into Saladin's forces with brutal force, their heavy cavalry plowing through the front lines. But Saladin's soldiers, disciplined and well-prepared, held firm. Their spears bristled like a wall of thorns, their shields locked tight. Saladin's heart raced as he watched the battle unfold before him. His commanders barked orders, their voices barely heard over the clash of steel and the screams of men. Dust clouded the air, making it hard to see, hard to breathe. But through the chaos, Saladin could feel it, the rhythm of the battle. He had learned to read the battlefield like a master tactician, to see not just the men fighting, but the patterns of movement, the ebb and flow of the fight. He saw the Crusaders pushing forward, relentless, but their horses, they were slowing. The sun, merciless and scorching, was beginning to take its toll. Saladin had planned for this. The heat, the exhaustion, it would be his ally today. His men had water. The Crusaders did not. "Patience," Saladin whispered, his eyes sharp as they scanned the battlefield. "Let them come." The Crusaders pressed harder, their knights cutting through Saladin's lines, but they were tiring. Saladin watched them closely, his pulse quickening. He knew the moment was near, the moment when they would falter. His heart pounded in his chest, every muscle in his body coiled, waiting for the right time to strike. And then, he saw it. A crack in the Crusaders' formation, a moment of hesitation, of weakness. "Now!" Saladin's voice rang out like a thunderclap, and his soldiers moved as one. His cavalry, waiting patiently at the flanks, surged forward, sweeping around the Crusaders like a tidal wave. The Muslim archers, positioned on the hills, unleashed a barrage of arrows, raining death upon the enemy. The Crusaders, caught between exhaustion and the relentless assault, began to falter. Their knights, once so strong, now struggled under the weight of their armor, their horses stumbling in the heat. Saladin's men pushed harder, their war cries echoing across the battlefield. The tide was turning. Saladin's heart raced as he rode forward into the fray, his sword flashing in the sun, cutting through the chaos. He was no longer just a commander watching from the distance. He was in the battle, his presence electrifying his troops, driving them forward. With each strike of his blade, with every command shouted over the noise, Saladin felt the weight of history pressing down on him. This battle, this moment, would be remembered for centuries. Every decision he made, every move his soldiers took, would shape the future of Jerusalem. Suddenly, a shout rose from the Crusader ranks. Saladin turned, his eyes narrowing as he spotted their king, Guy of Lusignan, in the midst of the battle. The Crusader king was surrounded, his forces crumbling around him. This was it, the final blow. If Saladin could capture him, the Crusader army would break. Saladin spurred his horse forward, charging toward the heart of the battle. His soldiers followed, cutting a path through the Crusaders like a blade through water. Guy of Lusignan's knights fought desperately to hold the line, but Saladin's forces were relentless. He could feel the momentum, the energy of victory building. And then, with one final surge, it happened. Guy of Lusignan was captured. The Crusader army, leaderless and broken, began to crumble. Panic spread through their ranks as they realized the battle was lost. One by one they fell, their will to fight shattered. Saladin stood tall in the saddle, his chest heaving, his sword still dripping with the blood of the battle. The Crusaders, the ones who had come to crush him, to hold on to Jerusalem, were retreating, defeated. The fields of Hattin were littered with the bodies of the fallen, but for Saladin, this was not just a battlefield, it was a turning point. The Crusaders had been broken, their forces shattered. Jerusalem was now within his reach. As the sun set over the plains of Hattin, casting long shadows across the blood-soaked ground, Saladin stood victorious. His men cheered, their voices rising into the darkening sky. But Saladin's thoughts were already on the road ahead. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. He turned his gaze toward the west, toward Jerusalem. The holy city, the prize he had fought for his entire life, was now closer than ever. But victory, he knew, would not come easily. The Crusaders would not give up Jerusalem without a fight. But Saladin was ready. He had faced the Crusaders at Hattin and emerged victorious. Now, with the strength of his army and the unity of his people, he would march on Jerusalem. The fate of the holy city hung in the balance, and Saladin was determined to tip the scales. The battle for Jerusalem was coming, and this time, history would be made. Chapter 10. Jerusalem Falls, a City Reclaimed. The gates of Jerusalem stood before Saladin, tall and ancient, their iron hinges creaking in the wind. For years, this moment had been just a dream, distant, elusive. But now, it was real. The holy city was within his grasp. His heart raced as he gazed upon it, the city bathed in the soft golden glow of dawn. The air was thick with anticipation, a silence so deep it felt as though the world was holding its breath. Saladin sat tall on his horse, his army gathered behind him, their banners fluttering gently in the breeze. The men were restless, eager to march into the city they had fought so long and hard to reclaim. The Crusaders had been defeated. The fields of Hattin had marked the end of their dominance. And now the city of Jerusalem, the sacred city, was finally his. But as he stared at the gates, Saladin knew this moment was about more than just victory. It was about legacy. The gates creaked open slowly, the sound echoing through the valley like a groan from the past. Saladin urged his horse forward, his soldiers following in silence. The streets of Jerusalem were eerily quiet, lined with people, watching, waiting. Some were hopeful, eyes filled with quiet relief. Others were fearful, their faces pale, their breaths shallow. And then there were those who looked broken. Their homes, their lives, had been caught in the whirlwind of war, and now they could only watch as a new conqueror marched through their city. Saladin rode through the streets, his face calm, his mind sharp. He could feel their eyes on him, the people, the soldiers, the Crusader knights who had surrendered to his mercy. His name had spread across the land, whispered in awe and fear. And now, every step he took echoed with expectation. The great conquerors of history had taken cities like this before. They had stormed through the gates with fire and blood, leaving destruction in their wake. But Saladin, he would not be like them. He had made a choice that would define him not just as a warrior, but as a leader. As Saladin approached the heart of the city, the Al-Aqsa Mosque rising before him like a beacon of faith, his heart swelled with emotion. This city, Jerusalem, held the weight of history, of faith, of centuries of longing. And now, it was his to protect. But how would he choose to rule it? Would his mercy be seen as strength or weakness? His commanders gathered around him, their eyes bright with triumph. One of them, a fierce warrior who had fought by Saladin's side for years, spoke first. "The city is ours, my lord. Shall we take what is owed to us? The Crusaders showed no mercy when they took this city. Should we not return the favor?" Saladin's jaw tightened. He remembered the stories, the horrors of the Crusaders' conquest of Jerusalem, the bloodshed, the massacre of innocents. And now, here he was, standing where they had stood with the power to do the same. He glanced at the people who watched him, their faces a mixture of hope and dread. His heart felt heavy. "No," he said softly, but with an edge of steel in his voice. "We will not stain this city with more blood. We have reclaimed Jerusalem, but we will show the world who we are. We will choose mercy." The commander blinked, clearly surprised, but he nodded. Saladin could feel the tension in the air. His soldiers had fought long and hard. They expected spoils, revenge. But Saladin had made up his mind. This city was too sacred to be defiled by more death. He would not be remembered as the man who brought more suffering to Jerusalem. The city buzzed with whispers of Saladin's decision. The people, Muslims, Christians, Jews alike, held their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Word spread quickly that Saladin had chosen mercy, that he would spare the lives of the Crusaders and the people who had taken refuge within the city walls. In the Crusader quarter, where fear had gripped the hearts of the remaining knights and citizens, the news hit like a shockwave. They had expected the worst, but now they stood in stunned silence, unsure of what to make of this conqueror who offered them their lives. Saladin walked through the streets, his commanders at his side, his eyes scanning the faces of the people. He could see the disbelief in their eyes, the question burning in their minds. Why? As he passed, a Christian priest stepped forward, trembling. He bowed deeply before Saladin, his voice shaky as he spoke. "My lord, we feared you would do to us what was done to your people." Saladin looked down at the man, his face calm, though his heart ached with the memories of what had been done. The massacre, the brutality. But those memories only strengthened his resolve. "I am not here to bring more death," Saladin said quietly, his voice carrying through the crowd. "Jerusalem is a city of faith, a city of peace. It belongs to all who worship here. I will not destroy it with hatred. You are free to leave or stay in peace." The priest's eyes filled with tears, and he bowed again, his voice choked with gratitude. "Thank you, my lord. May God bless you for your mercy." As the days passed, the streets of Jerusalem began to fill with life again. Those who had feared for their lives slowly emerged from their homes, their eyes filled with cautious hope. Saladin's soldiers respected the city, treating its people with honor. The Crusaders who had remained were allowed to leave peacefully, and Saladin even arranged for many Christian captives to be freed. The world was stunned. This was not the act of a conqueror hungry for blood. This was the act of a man who valued justice, who understood the true meaning of power. But there were those who whispered, who wondered, would this mercy be seen as weakness? Would Saladin's enemies think less of him for sparing the lives of those who had once been his oppressors? Saladin knew that question lingered in the minds of many, but as he stood once more at the gates of Jerusalem, gazing out over the city he had reclaimed, he felt no doubt. Mercy was not weakness. Mercy was strength. The holy city of Jerusalem was his. The dream he had carried with him since his youth, the dream of reclaiming this sacred land, had been realized. But Saladin knew that this was only the beginning. He had won the city, not just with his sword, but with his heart. And now the world would remember him not as a conqueror drenched in blood, but as a leader who had chosen compassion over cruelty. Saladin stood tall, the weight of his journey heavy on his shoulders, but his heart light. The city of Jerusalem had been reclaimed, and in doing so, he had shown the world that even in war, there could be honor. There could be mercy. As the sun set over the walls of the holy city, casting long shadows over the ancient stones, Saladin turned toward his men, his voice steady, filled with quiet pride. "Jerusalem is ours," he said, his eyes gleaming with determination, "and we will protect it with honor." The city, the people, the world watched, and history would never forget. Chapter 11. The Lion and the King. The Battle with Richard. The air was thick with tension, the winds of war howling across the desert. Saladin stood at the edge of his camp, gazing out toward the horizon. Beyond the dunes, a new enemy approached, an enemy unlike any he had faced before. Richard the Lionheart, the legendary Crusader king, a warrior known for his ferocity in battle, for his cunning, for his unwavering resolve. And now, he had come for the Holy Land. The clash of two worlds, two great leaders, was inevitable. Saladin knew this moment would come, had felt it in his bones long before the first rumors of Richard's arrival reached him. But now, as the dust from the Crusaders' march began to rise in the distance, Saladin's heart pounded with a new intensity. This would be no ordinary battle. This would be a test of everything he had ever fought for. The sun beat down mercilessly as Saladin turned to his commanders, his face calm, but his eyes filled with steely determination. "Prepare the men," he said quietly. "Richard is coming." Days later, on the plains outside Arsuf, the two armies finally faced each other. The Crusader forces, led by Richard, stretched out across the battlefield like an ocean of steel, their armor glinting in the sunlight. Banners bearing the symbol of the cross flapped in the wind, the heavy footsteps of their soldiers shaking the earth beneath them. Across from them, Saladin's army stood poised, their resolve as strong as the scorching sun overhead. The men whispered of Richard, the king who had traveled across the sea to face them. They had heard of his strength, his bravery, his victories in far-off lands. But today they would see for themselves. Saladin sat atop his horse, his sharp eyes scanning the battlefield. His heart raced, but his mind was calm. He had fought too many battles, faced too many enemies to be shaken now. But this was different. Richard was no ordinary foe. He was a king, a warrior with a reputation that stretched across continents. This would be a battle of minds, as much as it would be a battle of swords. The sound of a horn echoed across the plains, signaling the start of the battle. Richard's forces surged forward, a wave of knights and infantry, their war cries filling the air. Saladin's cavalry responded in kind, sweeping out from the flanks like a whirlwind, their hooves thundering across the sand. The two armies clashed with a deafening roar, swords striking against shields, spears piercing armor. The battlefield erupted into chaos. Saladin's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the battle unfold. His men fought valiantly, pushing back against the Crusaders with everything they had. But Richard's forces were strong, stronger than Saladin had anticipated. The Crusader king himself rode at the front of his army, his sword cutting through the air with deadly precision, his presence electrifying his troops. Wherever Richard went, his men followed with renewed energy, their confidence bolstered by their leader's unshakable will. From atop his horse, Saladin's eyes never left Richard. He could feel the weight of the Crusader king's presence, the pressure of their inevitable clash building with every passing moment. This battle wasn't just about land or power. It was about pride, about who would emerge as the true protector of the Holy Land. The heat of the battle grew fiercer with each passing minute. Saladin's cavalry swept in again and again, their arrows darkening the sky, striking down Crusader knights with deadly accuracy. But Richard's knights were relentless, their heavy armor and disciplined formations making them a formidable force. Saladin could see the weariness in his men's eyes, the exhaustion from fighting under the brutal sun. But they held their ground, spurred on by Saladin's presence, by the knowledge that this battle could change the course of history. Suddenly, a break in the Crusader lines appeared. Saladin seized the opportunity. With a cry, he urged his horse forward, leading his cavalry in a thundering charge. His sword flashed in the sunlight as he plunged into the heart of the Crusader army, his men following close behind. The impact was devastating. Richard's forces reeled from the sudden assault, their ranks thrown into disarray. For a moment it seemed as though victory was within Saladin's grasp. But then, Richard appeared. The Lionheart rode into the fray, his banner flying high above him, his sword raised. His presence alone was enough to turn the tide of battle. He was a whirlwind of fury, cutting through Saladin's forces with the skill of a seasoned warrior. The two armies collided once more, but now all eyes were on the two leaders, Saladin, the protector of Jerusalem, and Richard, the king who had come to reclaim it. The battle raged on, the sounds of clashing steel and the cries of men filling the air. But as the sun began to sink lower in the sky, both armies began to falter, the weight of the day's fighting taking its toll. Still, neither side was willing to back down. The tension between the two leaders was palpable, their every move watched closely by their soldiers. Saladin's heart pounded as he watched Richard from across the battlefield. The Crusader king was a formidable opponent, but Saladin knew he had one advantage: patience. He could see the exhaustion in Richard's eyes, the weariness in his movements. The Crusaders had come far, had fought hard, but the desert heat was not their ally. Saladin's forces knew this land, knew how to fight in the harsh conditions, and that would make all the difference. But Richard was relentless. Even as his men grew tired, he fought on, his sword flashing in the dying light. His determination was unmatched, his will as unyielding as the steel he wielded. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the battlefield in shadows, the fighting slowed. Both sides withdrew, their armies battered, but not broken. The battle was not over, but neither had won. Saladin and Richard had faced each other, tested one another's strength, and found an equal match. That night, as the campfires flickered in the distance, Saladin sat alone, his mind racing with thoughts of the day's events. Richard was unlike any enemy he had ever faced. The Crusader king's courage and strength were undeniable, but Saladin knew that this war would not be won with strength alone. It would be won with strategy, with patience, with the understanding that sometimes victory was about more than just the battlefield. The war between Saladin and Richard the Lionheart would continue, their forces clashing again and again across the Holy Land. But both men had earned each other's respect. Two lions, two unmatched minds, locked in a struggle for the fate of Jerusalem. The world watched as their battle unfolded, wondering which leader would emerge victorious. But for now, the Holy Land remained in the balance. The battle for Jerusalem was far from over. Chapter 12. Legacy of a Legend, the Price of Peace. Peace. But at what cost? The battlefield had fallen silent. No more war cries. No more clashing of swords. No more blood soaking the earth. After years of relentless warfare, Saladin had done what few believed possible. He secured a truce with Richard the Lionheart, the legendary Crusader king. The treaty between them marked the end of the fighting, at least for now. Jerusalem would remain under Muslim control, but Christian pilgrims could visit freely. A compromise, but not a victory for either side. Saladin sat in his tent, the heavy canvas walls rippling in the desert wind. The peace had come, but the scars of war ran deep. His body, once filled with the vigor of youth, now bore the weight of countless battles, of sleepless nights, of the burdens of leadership. His hands, which had once lifted swords with ease, now trembled ever so slightly, as if the years of warfare had stolen something from him. Outside, the world seemed quieter than it had in decades. His soldiers were weary, but relieved. The people of the Holy Land could finally breathe again, free from the constant threat of violence. But Saladin was restless. He gazed out into the darkening sky, his mind swirling with thoughts of the past, of the journey that had brought him here. The years had been long and costly. Saladin had fought his way through countless battles, led armies, reclaimed lands, and defended his people with every ounce of strength he had. But now, as he grew older, the weight of it all pressed down on him. He thought of the men who had followed him, who had trusted him with their lives, so many of them gone, their faces lingering in his memory like shadows. Was this peace worth the price they had paid? His heart ached with the losses he had endured, his brothers in arms, his commanders, his friends, even his enemies. They had all been part of this story, woven into the fabric of his life. He had fought for justice, for faith, for his people. But in the end, what had it all cost him? What had it cost the world? Saladin closed his eyes, his mind drifting back to his youth, to the days when he was just a boy in Tikrit, dreaming of conquest. Back then, everything had seemed so clear. The path before him had been filled with possibilities, with promises of glory. He had envisioned himself as a great warrior, a leader who would unite the Muslim world and bring peace to the Holy Land. But now, standing at the end of that path, he could see the truth more clearly. The victories he had won were not without sacrifice. Every battle had taken something from him, chipped away at his spirit, until all that was left was a man who had seen too much, who had lost too much. His name would echo through history. Of that he was certain. But what would that name represent? A conqueror? A peacemaker? A man who fought for justice? Or a man who was shaped by war? The truce with Richard had been hard-earned, a delicate balance of power, faith, and politics. The Lionheart had proven himself a worthy adversary, and though the two men had fought on opposite sides, Saladin could not help but respect him. They were, in many ways, two sides of the same coin, both warriors, both leaders, both driven by a vision that extended far beyond the battlefield. But even as peace settled over the land, Saladin knew it was fragile. Peace was always fragile. The Holy Land was a place of deep divisions, of clashing faiths and competing interests. The truce with Richard would hold for now, but how long before another wave of Crusaders crossed the sea? How long before the fires of war were ignited once again? The fight for justice, for peace, never truly ended. It was a battle that lived on in the hearts of men, passed down from generation to generation. And Saladin, though weary, knew that his part in that battle would continue, even after he was gone. His legacy, his choices, would ripple through history, shaping the future of the Holy Land and beyond. Saladin rose from his seat and walked to the edge of the tent, his gaze falling on the camp that stretched out before him. His men, his loyal soldiers, the ones who had fought beside him through the darkest days, were gathered around small fires, their faces tired but content. They had won a moment of peace, and for them that was enough. They had earned it. But for Saladin, peace came with a heavy heart. He thought of Jerusalem, the city he had fought so hard to reclaim. It was still under his control, a symbol of everything he had strived for. But he knew that Jerusalem was more than a city. It was a dream, a hope, a promise of something greater. And that promise was far from fulfilled. As the night deepened, Saladin found himself thinking of the future, of the generations that would come after him, of the leaders who would rise to take his place. Would they continue the fight for justice, for peace? Or would they fall into the same traps, the same cycles of violence and revenge that had plagued the Holy Land for centuries? He could not know. He could only hope. His eyes drifted to the stars above, glittering like distant memories in the vastness of the sky. They reminded him of his own journey, of the countless nights he had spent under this same sky, wondering what the future would hold. And now, as he neared the end of that journey, he knew that his legacy was not in the battles he had fought, but in the peace he had sought. Saladin's name would live on. The world would remember him as a warrior, a leader, a man who had reclaimed Jerusalem and brought together the Muslim world in a time of chaos. But more than that, they would remember his mercy, his compassion, his willingness to spare even his enemies. But as he stood there, alone with his thoughts, Saladin knew one simple truth. Peace, true peace, was never guaranteed. It was something you fought for, bled for, sacrificed for. And even then, it could slip through your fingers like sand. The price of peace, Saladin realized, was eternal vigilance. And that, perhaps, was his greatest lesson of all. As the stars twinkled above him, Saladin smiled faintly, his heart heavy yet full. His journey was nearly over, but the legacy of that journey, the fight for peace, for justice, would live on. The Holy Land would endure, and so in some way would he.